NFL insider Tom Pelissero breaks down reasons for Shedeur's draft free fall. Ladies and gentlemen, the biggest story maybe in NFL draft history was the Shedeur Sanders fall. It is a case study, and it will be a case study. I believe it was a seminal moment in sports media. It was absolutely insane, and Tom Pelissero was on the front of it the entire time. Now, Brian Daboll has come out and given some information on the Shedeur Sanders slide, and it seems to kind of paint a different picture than I think Stephen A. Smith and some other people are painting over at ESPN. But we're going to listen to it, react along the way, and see if we can figure out what caused the slide.
The story of the draft. Which one? You could choose one to tell the story of the 2025 NFL draft. It might be the obvious one. It might not be. You're the one who has all these stories coming across. What do you got for me, Tom?
Listen, there were a bunch of unique stories. You had multiple future first-round picks moved in trades on day one, which is, clearly not something that we saw over the past year. You had, the Giants taking Abdul Carter, then moving up for Jaxson Dart. But I think that, when we're thinking back on this, at least for the next couple of years, it's all going to come down to who went number 144 overall. There were a lot of different layers to the Shedeur Sanders story. I was not surprised he didn't go in round one. I was surprised that no one took him on day two. But at the same time, the NFL tends to render its verdict on the quarterback position in general. This year, the verdict was, as we thought going in, this beyond Cam Ward was not a very good quarterback class. You saw the Giants again come back in for Dart. You saw Tyler Shuck go in the second round, but Jalen Milroe not going until the late third.
Yeah, I think talk about a perfect storm. But in general, I think the overall sentiment with all of the quarterbacks this year was a bit off, right? Even like Quinn Ewers. It was not that long ago that people were talking about Quinn Ewers. Maybe he'll be there at 32. Maybe he'll be there at 33. Maybe he'll be there at 40. Could the Giants or the Browns or the Saints take him in the second round? Quinn Ewers almost didn't get drafted. Take away Shedeur. Take away all those guys. Almost every single quarterback was completely misdiagnosed. Besides Cam Ward, who was going one the entire time, almost all of them were completely missed. Quinn Ewers, Will Howard, Kyle McCord, all these guys, Milroe. Milroe got invited to the draft. We're sitting there thinking maybe he's a first-round pick. Could he get in the top 15? Could someone take him? Could he jump up into the half of the first round? No, not even close, right? And then, of course, the Shedeur thing. So it was just every single quarterback was whiffed on. Now, where this becomes interesting with Shedeur is that I think ESPN's hubris of we're right, they're wrong, and ESPN's they were forcing the Shedeur story. I think because of that, it cast this secondary wave for NFL teams where Shedeur doesn't go in the first round. Okay, ESPN made it a societal personal attack. So then all of a sudden, NFL teams are looking around well, man, if we take Shedeur, we're going to have to deal with this backlash. We're going to have to deal with answering questions and the spotlight and the storyline. But now Shedeur is sliding into that backup quarterback territory, right? He's sliding into that second, third round. And teams don't want to draft a second, third, fourth round quarterback that's going to come with a ton of attention, right? They don't want that to happen. So that forced Shedeur to slide even more. And then we got him in the fifth round. Is Shedeur a fifth rounder? No. He probably should have gone in that third round. But because of the story, because of the spotlight, he slid. Just like whenever Tim Tebow was playing, and Tebow wasn't on any teams. Tebow was absolutely, at that time, a backup level quarterback. But teams didn't want him on the roster because he's commanding all of the attention. He is the story. He is a distraction whether he wants to be or not. So teams are just if I can have Tim Tebow with all that spotlight and drama, or I can have Case Keenum and no one's asking me any questions, I'm going with Case Keenum. And that's what teams did. Teams said, if I can go with blank quarterback or deal with a veteran or sign somebody else and they can just be a backup and whatever, I don't have to worry about it, I will happily do that. And then eventually the value got too high to where a team said, yeah, screw it, for a fifth, I'll take the chance.
There were guys like Quinn Ewers who've won a lot of football games ending up going in the seventh.
Yeah.
We would have probably talked about those things more if not for Shedeur Sanders coming all the way down to the fifth round, where he ends up not only not being one of the first 6 picks by the Browns in the draft, but not even the first quarterback that they took. And again, we can get into all different angles of this, but I think the fundamental lesson here, Rich, was as much as from a media perspective, there was this kind of debate throughout the pre-draft process of Cam Ward versus Shedeur Sanders. I would just tell you, going all the way back to before the combine, within the league, that was not really the case. Within the league, it was Cam Ward, draw a line, and then shuffle the deck between the next 3 or 4 guys. Obviously, Shedeur Sanders ended up being the one who was shuffled out, and we'll see what his story holds now in the midst of a very, very unique depth chart that he's now on in Cleveland.
Well, I mean, you can even look at like Mel Kiper's mock 3.0, where he had Shedeur going to the Saints at 9. That was cool and a fun story. But looking back now, like Tom is saying, there's obvious a huge difference in what Mel was thinking and then how the Saints were prioritizing their draft board. The Saints were prioritizing Senior Bowl, workouts, interviews, combine, all of that. Shedeur didn't do any of that. So I don't ever believe the Saints were in the Shedeur Sanders sweepstakes. I think they just were looking for something else. Now, if he would have done the combine and had the interviews and done all that stuff with the Saints, maybe. But you could tell from their entire draft picks, all the way from Kelvin Banks down to down to Danny Stutzman, like they wanted a very specific thing. And Shedeur never fit it. So that alone shows you like the weeks or 2 weeks or a month where Mel Kiper and ESPN is driving Shedeur at 9. Deion Sanders saying he likes black and gold and all that stuff. It's like they're driving this, but in reality, I don't think Kellen Moore and the Saints ever were entertaining Shedeur Sanders.
Third day, man. That one's just tough to understand. Third day, that's really tough to understand, And first night, I get it. Second night, I'm wondering if anything that's playing into it has to do with, as I said on Friday night, teaching the Sanders family a lesson, maybe concerned that Deion would be lording over someone's job if it didn't work out.
I don't think there was any, again, I think it's all pretty obvious. I don't think there was any collusion, any of that going on whatsoever. It also was a perfect storm of who needed quarterbacks. This was a weird year where not many teams really needed a quarterback. I mean, we talked about this with the Saints, where you had Cleveland, New York, and then everyone else had a quarterback. It was either New England or the Raiders, who just got Geno, or the Jets, who just got Justin Fields, or the Panthers, who have Bryce Young, or every team in that area already had one. So then whenever Jaxson Dart went, Cam Ward goes, Tyler Shuck goes, well, who needs a quarterback, right? And then you get into the backup world, which then brings you to exactly what I'm talking about, where you are now drafting backup quarterbacks. So you don't want the distraction and the story and the spotlight that ESPN is putting on you.
I don't know. Why did he fall to day 3 based on your knowledge reporting? Because, again, you had all those unnamed folks in your must-read pre-draft tome, is the only way to put it, on NFL.com about the quarterbacks and top players in the draft. What's your opinion of the day 3-ness of it all, Tom?
Well, let's start with this. Philosophically, there's a lot of NFL teams that believe if you think you're getting a franchise quarterback, you think you're getting a starter, you take him in round 1, and value be damned. Don't worry if you had him graded as a low one, a mid one, and you take him up at the top or whatever. If you think you're getting a franchise quarterback, you take him in a first. Now, at the same time, philosophically, those teams also believe that if you think you're getting a backup caliber player, if it's not a surefire starting quarterback, you don't take him in the second or third, because at what other position would you draft a backup player with that type of a premium draft pick where you can get a starter and somebody who's going to be able to help you at another position? And you saw that kind of divide this year. Again, you had Cam Ward go 1, Jaxson Dart goes late 1 after the Giants trade back up and in. Tyler Shuck goes at the top of 2, but that's really because the Saints maybe didn't value him as the number 9 pick. But if their pick had been at the end of the first, they probably feel comfortable taking Tyler Shuck. And then you had this big gap until Dylan Gabriel and Jalen Milroe end up going late third down in like that compensatory pick area. Again, that's kind of the spread that you a lot of times get just because teams don't want to take a guy to be their backup quarterback with a pick that they could get somebody who could be plug and play and help them at another position right now. And again, I go back to, I remember you asked me the question before the draft, Rich, of, okay, what's the debate over who will be QB3? And I said, the real debate is QB 2, 3, 4, 5, because it was Cam Ward was the one guy who profiled as a starter.
Yeah, we said this a lot where it's like, all right, you got 10 quarterbacks and you can tell me any different combination, I believe you. If you told me Quinn Ewers win the second, I believe you. If you told me Kyle McCord win the second, I believe you. If you told me Quinn Ewers didn't get drafted, I believe you. If you told me Shedeur went 17th, I believe you. If you told me Jalen Milroe went first round, I believe you. Like, it was such this like puzzle, this like mismatched kind of, I mean, even like Will Howard, like guys like that who just kind of got lost in the shuffle. There were so many quarterbacks in this draft that were all kind of interchangeable. Riley Leonard, like players like that, or it was just so close. So it was kind of just any given moment, any given week. I mean, we did videos on Quinn Ewers, Shedeur Sanders, Kyle McCord, Tyler Shuck, Jalen Milroe. Like every single quarterback was available for every team in every round in the pre-draft process.
And then you got different opinions about Shedeur, Jaxson Dart, Tyler Shuck, and Jalen Milroe. And those 4 guys were in different orders on everybody's draft board. I would say this too, and I do it every year. I talk to dozens of coaches and scouts and front.
I mean, look at this. Like Cam Miller, Tommy Mellott went ahead of Quinn Ewers. And it was not that long ago that Quinn Ewers was being mocked at 40. Not only does he get taken 200 picks later, but he gets taken after Graham Mertz, Tommy Mellott, Cam Miller, Curtis Rourke.
Front office people and try to build the full tapestry because the quarterback position, it is subjective on some levels. One person's not going to see it the same way. And in past draft classes, I remember last year I had people telling me, there were multiple people who said Jaden Daniels for me is over Caleb Williams. Even go back to, and again, some of these are right, some of these are wrong. There were people saying Zach Wilson. I would take Zach Wilson based on his final year tape over Trevor Lawrence. There was nobody who was arguing that I spoke to for Shedeur Sanders over Cam Ward as the number 1 quarterback in this draft. Our colleague Bucky Brooks was adamant. He had him as his number 1 quarterback. Mel Kiper Jr., who's the godfather, had him as the number 1 quarterback and obviously made a point during ESPN's draft coverage of why he felt like Shedeur should have been going. But that was just not an opinion that I heard within the league. In fact, I had more people, at least 1 or 2, tell me they'd argue for maybe Jaxson Dart over Cam Ward just based upon the total body of work, based on the physical traits, how they see him fitting into an NFL offense. So right there, that was part of the tell to me that Shedeur maybe could go in the first, but when you really got down to draft day, it was, all right, it's the Giants, maybe the Steelers, or else somebody's going to have to trade up or Shedeur's going to slide. Then once you got beyond round 1, part of the reason sometimes you get guys drafted in the...
I was in a text message group talking about the draft, and when the Saints took Shuck, everyone in the group was like, Shedeur's going to fall to the 3rd round. Because you look at the rest of the draft, and it's like, who the hell in here is taking a quarterback in the 2nd round? Like it all kind of became obvious, but the problem was the media narrative of every single pick that happened. This should have been Shedeur. This should have been him. Why wasn't he going here? And if you just step back and removed your kind of hubris or ego from it, you could kind of tell, like, he's not going to go to one of these 2nd round teams. Like, why would they take him there? But they've got 5 hours of draft coverage to fill.
2nd, 3rd rounds are because you have teams that don't need a quarterback, and they just go, hey, this name, as you're looking at your board stacked horizontally, we got all these guys here, and then there's this one guy at quarterback. Well, we don't need a quarterback, but how are we not going to take that guy? How are we not going to take a quarterback? It's like when the Eagles took Jalen Hurts. We got Carson Wentz. We feel great about him, but gosh, we think this Jalen Hurts might be something, so let's take him at the end of the 2nd. I think that's where, when you really unwind the process with Shedeur Sanders, there were maybe some decisions that were made and opportunities that were missed that could have had him come off the board a little bit sooner. In fact, I talked late Friday night. It was like midnight in Green Bay, and I got a call from a GM who was thinking about taking Shedeur on Saturday. And we were just kind of talking through, how is this even possible? He pointed all the way back to something that Dion said on a podcast in like February or March of 2024, which was the infamous, hey, if Shedeur or Travis Hunter, they get taken by a team that I don't think they should go to, we're going to pull an Eli, right?
Yeah, that was the Cleveland, which is kind of ironic. But yeah, it was longer than that. It was like 2018. It was a long time ago. But he said Cleveland. He was like, if they get taken there, we might pull an Eli Manning.
We're going to blow it up and we're going to get him out of there. And that's kind of how Shedeur, who did not hire an agent, he was getting advised by his father. He was getting advised maybe by a publicist, but he did not have an agent navigating the process. He kind of approached it like Dion had all those decades ago. There's all the famous Dion quotes about, I thought I was scared Detroit was going to draft me. I would ask for so much money they would have to put me on layaway. The Giants gave me this huge book, this test, and I said, "What pick do you have? 10? I'm not taking all that." Shedeur went into this process and very much seemed like it was, I'm going to dictate where I go rather than the league dictating to me. And
yeah, I mean, so what's come out now is from Brian Daboll and the Giants, and it was about how Shedeur in the draft or the interview process, he made a mistake or he didn't pick up on a planted mistake. So they had in the film study or whatever they were doing, had planted a mistake that they wanted Shedeur to catch. He didn't catch it, and Shedeur was almost mad at the Giants for that whole thing. We heard, during his combine interviews, we heard Shedeur say that, he wasn't going to change for a franchise, and teams should know what they're drafting when they draft him, and that his body of work speaks for it. And yeah, Tom's right. He did kind of approach it with the same kind of air of, if you want to see me throw, watch my tape. If you want to see why you should draft me, watch that. Don't worry about an interview. Don't worry about a workout. Don't worry about this. And when it came down to it, that forced teams like the Giants to pass. And because of the uniqueness of this draft, there weren't that many suitors. So in reality, the only teams that you should have been falling all over for were the Browns, were the Giants, and were the Saints, the teams that truly needed a quarterback. And when those three were gone, then it was just kind of up in the air. And it just got caught up in that. But it was such a wild misuse of, or a wild study of how the misuse of media by Dion, by Shedeur, but also by ESPN. Because while the draft is happening, I can promise you, ESPN's coverage is on in these draft rooms. So these teams are hearing this. These teams are listening to Mel Kiper. These teams are listening to the coverage. And this story, I can promise you, turned teams off. I can promise you the Tim Tebow first take debates stopped teams from signing Tim Tebow as a backup. I can promise you the debates around Colin Kaepernick and just the first take and all of that stopped teams from putting him on a roster. These are billion-dollar teams, billion-dollar owners, and that kind of distraction, that whole thing, if they don't have to deal with it, they absolutely will not. And it was just 4 different players all kind of mismanaging it, all wrapped into one bubble, and that's what led to the slide.
And I say this as objectively as I possibly can, Rich. The league's verdict was Shedeur was not a good enough prospect as a player to be able to proceed that way. And I don't mean that on a personal level. It was a matter of, because some of these interviews went as badly as they did, because he seemed to have more interest in just a few teams than other teams. There were some, I'm sure, general managers, scouts, coaches. There were a lot of people that told me they were turned off by the process. Those are the very people that once Shedeur gets out of the first, second round, they might have had a third round grade on the guy. And it's we didn't have a good experience. In other words, he didn't answer some of those questions, whether as a player or a person. There were questions other teams had that never got answered. So on that,
it's kind of like the Dion example Tom just gave, where if Dion's what pick do you have? 10? I'm not answering these questions. if Dion falls and he needs the Giants to pick him, the Giants aren't picking him, right? Because the whole process went so sour. So same thing with Shedeur, where leading up into the process, you're probably thinking like, I could go here, I could go here, I could get drafted by the Raiders, I could get drafted by the Jets, I could get drafted by this team, I could get drafted by this team. And then come draft day, it's like, damn, there's only like 2 teams that could draft me because the Titans aren't. The Titans are taking Cam Ward. So once you get past that, it is an absolute just crapshoot. I think Shedeur was a 3rd round graded prospect. I think that's where most teams had him. They had him in that late second, or not even late second because the teams weren't there in the late second. So I think in the 3rd, you would have seen like the Browns or teams like that who didn't have a quarterback. Okay, let's take Shedeur. But then the circus happened with ESPN. And I think that pushed him to the 5th. I'll make a bold prediction here. If the draft was not aired, I think he goes in the 3rd round to the Browns. I think the Browns take him and they don't take Gabriel. But the Browns took Gabriel. There's not a doubt in my mind. They took Gabriel, and that was them saying, we're out. That was them saying, we are out of the circus. We are not going to keep every single pick we have. We are not going to answer this. We're not going to be a part of the conversation, whatever. Then I think when the 5th rolled around, the value was too high. And I think they just looked around and said, value's too high, too good of a risk-reward algorithm here. We got to do it. And they ended up taking them. But, yeah, I think you saw about 2 rounds suppressed strictly because of the coverage.
That level, maybe we shouldn't be surprised that he ends up going, albeit in the 5th round, to one of the teams that did get the work. The Browns did have him on a visit. They did get to spend the additional time with him. And for all that said, Rich, if Shedeur wants to play sooner than later, I can't think of a better place he could have landed than Cleveland. You've got a depth chart right now where they have Joe Flacco, who they gave like $3 million guaranteed to. They traded a 5th round pick for Kenny Pickett. They took Dylan Gabriel in the 3rd. They take Shedeur in the 5th. And Deshaun Watson, who's making more money than all those guys combined, probably doesn't play this year. There's not a lot of examples of a 5th round pick ending up starting. Obviously, Sam Howell got his opportunity after his draft slide a few years ago in Washington, but in a pretty wide open depth chart, why wouldn't Shedeur Sanders have the opportunity to prove to everybody, to the extent that he may have, felt like he got downgraded unfairly through the process? I'm going to go out and show you. You're going to have the opportunity now in Cleveland. Let's see what he does with it.
I had heard at one point in the draft, it was one of these sources, but they said if Shedeur doesn't go to the Browns, he's not going to get drafted because it was just such a weird, unique situation, and the Browns ended up taking him because, like Tom said, there were only a couple teams that actually got to do have any work or know him at all. And you can take the Giants off the list because they took Dart. You can take the Saints off the list because they took Shuck. So then it's like, damn, literally the only team now, the only team available really is Cleveland. And that's ended up where he goes. So, yeah, it was. I mean, I love breaking down like sports media and things like that. And this is just fascinating how ESPN kind of like, the meme of the guy pointing in the mirror, he's pointing at himself, obviously. Like, that's what ESPN was. ESPN's like, why hasn't Shedeur been drafted yet? But the reason Shedeur hasn't been drafted was because of ESPN. Same with like all the other examples I gave. Like, why isn't Tim Tebow on a roster? It's like exactly because of y'all. So interesting world. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let me know in the comments below what you think. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.